Hi, we are Group 12. In this video, we are going to discuss the modeling of liquid sloshing dampers.
The video of the free vibration test was processed in Tracker to obtain the time displacement data. This was then imported into MATLAB and fitted to the exponentially decaying sinusoidal curve shown here using both the MATLAB curve toolbox and by manually calculating logarithmic decrements. This gave the system's original damping ratio and natural frequency as shown here. The only two remaining free vibration parameters are the system stiffness and mass, which are related via the angular frequency, hence if one is known, the other can be obtained. Two approaches were taken, firstly by calculating the stiffness initially, and secondly by calculating the mass initially. Given the lack of knowledge about material properties, this clearly led to some discrepancies. However, both methods of calculation yielded similar results. With the system parameters now known, the sloshing damper equations provided in the notes were looped over various values of water height in order to calculate the value given the lowest steady-state displacement. This required the calculation of the static displacement at this height, which was obtained as shown using the mass, base displacement of 5 mm, forcing frequency, and the cantilever stiffness. This led to an optimal water height of 16 mm with an expected displacement of 1 mm.
This experiment constituted of a model structure that was subjected to an almost harmonic base motion provided by a shaking table at a dominant frequency of 3.5 Hz. The resultant motion of the structure was recorded using the phone camera at a frame rate of 240 frames per second. This was deemed sufficient for the experiment as the resultant frequency of motion of the structure was not a multiple of this frame rate and was smaller than the frame rate of the camera. Consequently, consecutive frames showed small differences to the previous frame, and a detailed analysis of the motion of the structure could be carried out. The video recording of the experiment was then analysed using Tracker. During our initial analysis, a base amplitude of 10 mm was assumed. However, upon reviewing the obtained data, it was noticed that the base amplitude was 5 mm. This correction was subsequently implemented in all further calculations.
From the video of the model under design conditions, the displacements were measured in order to compare our predicted results. These displacements were measured using the Tracker software. Initially, the total displacements of the top of the structure was measured from 7.6 to 19.6 seconds in the video, corresponding to the starting and stopping of the base motion. As the predicted values we have found are in terms of displacement relative to the base displacement was also recorded by tracking a position near the bottom of the column. Finding the difference between the top and base displacements allowed for the displacement relative to the base to be found. In this figure, it can be seen that within the first 2 seconds, the maximum displacements relative to the base vary largely, whereas after this point, they remain relatively similar. This is because the initial base movement means transient motion is formed, causing these variations. Transient motion is also present when the base is stopped. As we require steady-state displacements only, the results after 2 seconds and before the base is stopped are considered.
As seen on this plot, the initial prediction greatly underestimates the displacement amplitude. We attempted to rectify this by accounting for the additional structural stiffness from the mass of water in series with the main structure. Even though it provided an estimate much closer to the observed steady-state displacement, we recognize this is likely to be incorrect.
The experimental data gives a profile that differs to the smoothness of the prediction. The small variation in amplitude in the response could be due to beat phenomenon, in which the water transfers the absorbed energy back to the main structure, causing a fluctuation in the amplitude, contrary to expectations for steady state. However, the change in amplitude is slight, suggesting wave breaking observed interfered with the energy transfer process. It was also observed that the base motion was not harmonic, as the wave shape was irregular with varying peak amplitudes. This could cause errors in the steady-state response estimate, as the model applied may not be suitable.
Examining the fluid behavior indicate more issues on our analytical models. On the one hand, the energy dissipation due to fluids hitting the lid was not accounted for. On the other, the simplified linear models fail to account for nonlinear effects, such as wave breaks, which can provide more damping and dissipates energy. This also explains why forked peaks were observed. Given that Tracker does not match the frames with the reference perfectly, these experimental errors are said to have minimal effects on the results.
The difference between the estimations and observed displacements is implied by the uncertainty associated with the assumptions made. The severe underestimation of 0.5 mm is likely due to the uncertainty of the infill density, which directly affects the stiffness of the structure, causing incorrect UST predictions. Additionally, the model does not take into account the inertial forces exerted by the free-flowing water on the structure when there's a change in direction in the base motion. This inertial force causes additional displacement that was unaccounted for. Moreover, the model does not take into account the gravitational pull when the top column is curved, which would cause additional displacement. Incorrect assumptions made for a structure's properties such as density, geometry, and homogeneity of the material could invalidate our predictions if they significantly differ from reality. We also assume that there were no period variation when measuring the natural frequency of the structure.
One of the main takeaways from completing this coursework was the effect that sloshing dampers have on the displacement of structures. From the simple experiment, it was observed that the addition of only 16 mm of water caused the observed displacements to reduce by more than half, from 8.3 to 4 mm. Another takeaway from this coursework was learning how to deal with multiple unknowns within a modeling problem. This led us to think ahead and determine a method which relied on the least amount of unknowns, thus minimizing the sources of error within our solution. Additionally, the importance of multiple degree of freedom system was noted, as a single degree of freedom model provided a rough estimate and more degrees of freedom are needed due to the rotation of the model point mass. This coursework allowed us to explore in greater depth the underlying physics associated with sloshing dampers. We learned that the analytical solutions do not capture most of the physical processes associated with dampers, and hence empirical results are heavily used. With limited resources and site access, we used our engineering judgment to determine whether obtained solutions were reasonable and hence determine whether possible errors existed within a formulation of the problem. We also gained a greater understanding of using computer vision sensing software. As we identified a possible error within our solution, a further improvement of our work would be to try and identify this error and correct our results to obtain a more accurate predicted value of displacement.